So I'm trying to think about what's going on with a kind of set of shifts in racial capitalism. Oh, and it's all right, okay. I'm not going to go through the whole thing of, well, what is the framing of racial capitalism, but just to remind ourselves, and because we're a mixed and varied audience, that to think about the ways that I have been schooled to think of the terms of racial capitalism is, I always say, it's a question. You know, it's not the last theory, it's not the final end word of how we might understand capitalism, but it's a question that tries to comprehend the tendency to differentiate populations, including when you're incorporating them into economic circuits. I shouldn't have said markets, economic circuits, a better thing. So, you know, what is it that in a global system that acts as if we are all interchangeable, replaceable, unmarked by any social markers or any history? You know, that's the idea of stripping us down to just what good we are, to the process of accumulation. What's going on when other kinds of narrative prevent us being in solidarity or split us from each other or make it so we don't see each other in the economic processes? Now, what are those differentiations that confound our ability to be a unified class subject or just a people together? So racial capitalism is a kind of way of thinking about those questions, which seem to me still pretty apt questions. I have to change where the people are, because you can't see the writing. Okay, there we go. So if we look backwards, which I think quite a lot of the work about racial capitalism understandably looks backwards, because it's like, you know, how have we got to this place? So clearly it's helped us understand how populations are put together around ideas of being waged, sometimes waged and unwaged. And in unwaged, I'd include forced, indentured, captured, imprisoned. But to think of those ways of working or creating value or having value stripped from you is in a constellation. So instead of acting as if capitalism is one train journey and we're all in the waiting room waiting to enter waged work, I don't know if people still think that, but certainly for most of my political and academic lifetime, there's been a strong policy and kind of labor economics push towards the idea that everyone is waiting to become a wage worker. Like, that's the only trajectory. Even the UN Millennium Goals, I've forgotten, one of the big bits about gaining prosperity is getting everyone into paid work. So like when you get to be a wage worker, then all the goodies appear. Racial capitalism says, well, look, that has never been the case. So these different ways that people are placed, and they're kind of in relation to each other. And those different ways of being placed have often, although maybe not only, and I think that's always a confusion, I think, about how racial is the racial of racial capitalism, but has been around enforced differentiation of populations, including often enforced by official violence in ways that enhance the pursuit of profit for different kinds of actors. And the spatial and temporal segregation of work and of life embeds that kind of racialized logic in capital accumulation. So spatial is the township is here, the white town is here, or raw material extraction is down here in this part of the globe, component production is up here. Temporal is even in the same city, someone rides the 4 o'clock bus to come and clean and gets back home before someone else comes to work in the office. So all those ways that we live in that kind of parallel life. And that those spatial and temporal segregations of work are echoed in life. So all of the histories of segregation and enclosure that we've lived through, sorry, thank you. I've been brought a cup of tea, that is the disturbance, so a cup of tea is good. So as well as our working lives, the ways in which we've thought of racialized logics of the ghetto, the township, the barrier, the border are partly about those things. And those are all racialized logics, even though different groups of people get positioned on the outside or in the less advantageous position. I hope that makes sense as I go on. This is all the background, long intro. alongside all of this, I'm not going to talk about social reproduction today, although that is one of the things I too often talk about. But just in case you want to come back to it, that differentiated landscape where we don't all become the same kind of thing, that some people become an occasional agency worker, some people in a previous moment get to be a kind of labor aristocracy in a kind of workplace that is highly unionized and can look after itself. Some other people work in the part-time realm, which was meant to be for married women previously. All of those different ways of being positioned as what work could be for you is supplemented by social reproduction, but supplemented differently. And very importantly, groups have been racially subordinated in ways that work is not enough to keep them alive. So we can spit you out of the workplace quickly, or we can take your papers away, or we just will pay you an artificially depreciated wage because we have a whole structure of under protection and over policing that will ensure that. Social reproduction has played a greater supplement for those kinds of groups of people, because people have to live. So, where does that ability to live come from? Even for the proletarianized, that doesn't always come through the wage. There are other ways in which people share, make do a bit of work alongside, work off the books, pool their resources so it's possible to make it economically. A lot of stuff about housing in low-income communities across the world has been about how you pool your resources around an extended network to make sure everyone is housed, however poorly housed. So those kinds of things are about, that's the realm of social reproduction. Because social reproduction isn't only, although however important it is who cooks the dinner and who feeds the babies, it's also all of this other stuff about how bodies are remade. And that difference, I'm already talking too much about this first bit, those differences in different kinds of social reproduction, or like different supplements of social reproduction, have formed, I haven't got time to truly make this argument, let me say it because I think it's interesting, forms an important element of how racializing ascription has happened in a lot of places, maybe everywhere, certainly in Britain. But all of the debates about what is a proper or improper family, what the improperness of your family does to your entitlement to state support, how you might demonize different kinds of gendering and gendered roles within imagined households of different ethnicity. That's all part of saying how social reproduction happens in your racialized group is part of how we know you're racialized. They confirm each other. I hope that makes sense. If not, someone ask me afterwards or say something better about it. Come on, let me get on to the next bit. Oh, it's done that thing. No, I don't want to. Aha, here we go. This is really what I want to talk about. And I'll try not to just read off my slides and just tell you my story of things that have been preoccupying me. But the best things, I think, always where you don't know the answer yet, because once you think you know the answer, there's nothing more to say, is there? So I definitely don't know the answer, but I think there's an interesting question here. Those ideas of how we think about racial capitalism looking backwards, either in a long history in the ways in which enslavement and colonial dispossession make the economic landscape of today, or even in the kind of slightly more recent history of a certain idea of standard work and non-standard work around it, all of that seems a bit up for grabs. Certainly the idea of the standard waged worker who has full entitlements from both the employer and the state, and that combination of rights makes a certain kind of citizenship that is linked to your economic activity and which everything else flows from. Seems like we might talk about it, but that's not the direction of travel, is it? And instead, we are all living in quite acute and personally painful ways in many situations in very rapid changes in the organization of work and the place of waged work in a larger landscape of capital accumulation. And that's what I would like people to chat to me about. That's what keeps me up at night right now. Because I didn't know if this should be the first slide, but I should say it somewhere. I think the point of doing work around, scholarly work around racism or around capitalism, actually, or certainly both together, is to use our collective acumen to remain surprised and curious. I don't think there's much point in us meeting each other to say the world is miserable in predictable ways that we all already knew. If that's what we have to say, we don't have to meet each other to say that, do we? If we think that it is the same replay again and again. So at the very least, and I think lots of you have come through code, but I just assume some of you haven't. Lots of the last 2 decades of work trying to look at how we might understand race politically pushes us to this again and again. But one of the tricks of any racial order is to present itself as endlessly unchanging, as if it's inevitable, if not natural, because we're not so biologically referent now, but still the idea of like this just is how the world is. No work has to go into making it like this. There are no interests involved because it's just a description of the world, and you just have to live with it. Unsettling that apparent inevitability, not in order to say in a liberal way, oh, you think this, but I think that. You think criminalization, I think exciting menu options, that, not that kind of difference, but the difference which says every exercise of power requires extensive work and consolidation through a variety of means, and our job is to understand what that variety of work and consolidating power is. That makes it less inevitable. Doesn't mean they're not still winning, but it's about trying to see how the racial order is remade and whether it's the same components of the racial order, whether even racial order is still the right term, which I'd be interested to think about. And in a similar way, the apparent inescapability of capitalism, all that stuff about Mark Fisher saying that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which he might have been quoting Zizek, and like people don't quote either of them anymore, which seems a shame. That limiting of our imagination, which is also a limiting of our analytic reach, part of the game of being together must be to say, can't be, none of this must be like this. But how does it come to be like this, given that it has to be made somehow through a variety of processes? So I'm saying that because what I say next might, I guess further on, might be more annoying to some people in the room. So what I think I mean by that is that when I think about racial capitalism, I'm trying all the time not to fall back on giving racialized categorization an explanatory value, which of course is a real core approach probably across lots of people who analyze the politics of race. But it's tricky, it can still creep up on you. Like, you count where the black and brown people are. And it's made more tricky still, because even as we understand that racial subordination is, racialized subordination is remade again and again in every moment, it's not remade completely anew. There is this sedimented legacy of racialized dispossession. It's not like we all enter the social terrain unmarked and that there's a powerful body that says, you'll be the underclass today. I used to think these people are the underclass, but now I want that bit of coastal terrain they live on. Let's move it to those people. Because there's that sedimented history of how we all come to be here together, of what's been taken from whom, of what accumulative dispossession, demonization, and violence comes to, that we bring that, that there isn't a clean moment. It's not neoclassical economics, we're all a kind of unmarked actor. So some kind of balance between this thing of the process of racial capitalism in every moment, and I think something different is happening in our moment, positions people in a way that is racializing. It doesn't take people who are already racialized and say, I think you're worth twopence and you're worth 20p. Might do a bit of that because of sedimented dispossession. But what it does is it uses differentiation in a way which says, being made surplus by the changing imperatives of the national and the global economy in itself becomes a racializing process. Some of that might be to confirm a long history of being racially subordinated, but it equally might be a way of conjuring up or extending or stretching our languages of what racialization are. And I really hope that makes sense to someone in the room, because I'd really like to talk about that some more. But anyway, let me try and move on a bit quicker now. I've said quite a lot of things a bit too slowly. So these are the bits which you probably all know, but just so I've repeated them. What's happening in terms of work and employment globally? Overall, a contraction of waged work, or at least a contraction of waged work as a kind of proportion of what global economic activity is, and or the wage itself. I couldn't find those figures, but they're quite well known that the last number of decades have seen a very substantial shift away in the outcomes of the productive economy, how much of the value goes to employers and bosses and how much goes to workers. You know, that used to be a bit more even, and it's gone like that. Alongside this, a really rapid increase in indebtedness across the world. And I'm here interested in household personal indebtedness. I think there's a different story to be told about how we think about national indebtedness, but I'm thinking about the ways in which we as households, groups of people trying to live together, or as individuals become indebted. And that both those things together seem to remake or erode some of the racialized differentiations between populations. You can't rely on spatial positionings linked to a certain model of the economy, because that model of the economy isn't really there anymore. You know, maybe some people still live there, but the kind of crisis we have about loads of housing that no one wants to live in over here, and no housing over here where loads of single people are renting one room in someone's attic. That's partly a lag in the shift of how the spatial arrangements of residents in this country don't fit anymore what the economy is like. No point living in an estate that used to be an all-white estate if the work that supported that estate isn't there anymore. And debt, I think is tricky. But we'll get on to debt. Oh, move where the people are. Oh, no, not so quickly. Show you my picture first. Let me try and move the people. Right, okay. This is quite old. I mean, it's again, just if people don't read this stuff, about 2015, 16, the ILO started to do some very big projects about really the death of standard work. The ILO, as far as I could tell, was at that point still very invested in the idea that something called standard work was the objective for everyone. You know, a decent life means you will one day have a full-time, permanent wage labor job that can sustain your life. Maybe can't sustain the life of anyone else in your household, but you will have that. Of course, when it starts to do the mapping, it shows that that's very, very far from how people are working. And not only is it far from how people are working, it's going in the other direction. The mismatch between that kind of work and who is coming to need work. Is it a labour market if there is no labour? That's the other question, isn't it? But there's a big gap. There's always been a huge gap in terms of gender, that that women across the world are not incorporated into that kind of standard employment. But for young people, young people across the global south and increasingly flowing up across Europe and North America, there's just the aspiration to become a standard employee, to become a wage labourer in a way that organises the temporal flow of your life and sustains your life. That's not the game now. Oh, and this picture, this is not a great, I put this one because I wasn't sure how else to show it. This is supposed to be a map of household debt, and it shows you where the higher household debt is. What it does, though, as far as I could tell from the blurb of the people who did it, who in the link, is it really underestimates what household debt is like for all the people in the world who do not have ready access to formal financial instruments. So it's almost certainly, well, firstly, it's saying, I don't know what's happening in Africa. You can't see here. Africa is outlined, and it's mainly there's no data at all. And for other parts of the global south, they're shown as lower debt areas, but nothing we know from the sociology of debt confirms that. Instead, what we know is that the forms of household debt that people who are poor and more precariously employed or not employed at all engage in tend not to register in the kinds of global data gathering that these exercises do, because we know, and you probably all know different ways in which that indebtedness happens. So we should assume that this is really a scare story about how scared they are that even rich nations have very, very high levels of personal household debt. And they're not bothering to count everyone else, but we know they do as well. Moving the people around so I can read my bits. Oh, there we go. I haven't got time to say anything about platformization. And again, I'm kind of relying on people vaguely knowing, because it's in the ether, isn't it? I'm not queen of platform economics. I'm interested in that as a way of organizing corporate activity and what that does to employment, which we probably can no longer call employment. People who do much more focused and better work than me on this topic talk about the ways in which platform corporations squat on the economic landscape that's already made by previous phases of racial capitalism. So we can see who is likely to take on the different, not quite jobs of the platform economy. You can see that they're groups of people who've already, largely because of racialized politics, been pushed out of the formal labor market. That's why people, who does Deliveroo, who does Uber, who does different bits of the gig economy, now highly dependent on particular age ranges of migrant labor, of racialized men in certain spaces, often often kind of insecure in their ability to keep family around them or to maintain family, so that they might have a family in some other part in the migratory chain, but who's not yet joined them here. All those things I think are quite well documented, not by me. Can go and read Dalia Gabriel and other people who are working on that. But even though it kind of squats on that, the more theoretical and corporation level work on the platform economy talks in a way that to me seems like a very different non-logic of differentiation. And I'm saying with all the uncertainties of a change in employment paradigms. So, this is like, it's like when the factory comes. At some other moment when people are making stuff in their backyards and stuff, suddenly the factory comes and you don't know who's the factory is going to employ or not, who's going to make it or not, who's going to stay in the village or move, who used to be a big cheese in the local community, but it's just a faceless no one when we get to the big city. All of that kind of churn. In lots of ways, I think the still emerging power of the platform is that kind of churn for us. But it does seem to me to have a very different will to inclusion, that it's not easily understood as a way of shifting work that replicates the racialized segregation of the economy we've just left. It's not like, oh, it's all right, all the black and brown blokes can do security. It's all right, all the Asian women will do the piecework in their houses. It's not the economy as it was. I know a lot of you are younger than me, but in many of our lifetimes. And 30 or 40 or 50 years is not long in a period of shifting what work is like. Instead, platforms in different ways, we know they split tasks away from the idea of a job. They standardize, fragment and differentiate tasks so that people encounter the platform as a moment of payment for a moment of task across many different areas. They demassify the workplace even more than it's been demassified before, so that your encounter with a creature who will never say they're your employer, but you rely on for some kind of payment because you've still got to eat, is almost like an individual encounter. And they blur the kind of division between what is work and what is not work. So what I'm calling the realm of social reproduction, all the ways of remaking life as if there is a workplace that you then go to, that's kind of a in the air, isn't it? It's like work bits and pieces here and there. And even if not most of the economy is like that yet, as a model of operating as an employer, we can see it being kind of gathered up across different sectors. So I think that's the direction of travel. It's at least a possible direction of travel we need to clock if we're going to survive it together. And people know Amazon really did well. Okay, I can't look at this right now. Okay, sorry, other things coming out of the house. Everyone knows that Amazon did disgustingly well through the pandemic, but Amazon are just like, they're just one indication that replicating of Amazon-like approaches to employment and dispersing of tasks is more the thing that I think is of interest. And probably people in the room know that different universities have been trying to hitch onto that model and are in quite a dodgy partnership with Amazon as well, including my own employer. Right. I can do this in the next few minutes. Right. Indebtedness and platformization. I think those two things together, they remake how we might start to think about our our habits about how we think about racial capitalism. Because those two things together, indebtedness and platformization, they unsettle the differentiations of economic space of a previous moment of racial capitalism. And it's not so clear now how that temporal and spatial segregation works now. And as I've said, it might not yet be the dominant structure, but it's the new beast coming. And part of our job is to clock the new beast coming, not only have the same repeated kind of Barney that you have with the old beast. You might still have to fight the old beast as well in certain ways, but if there's any point to scholarship, it's also understanding when the new devils arrive, I think. That'd be put it on my gravestone probably. So what or how is the racialized labour market now? So of course, it continues. There's whatever the aspirational speech of different platforms about all of our data possibilities, you only have to walk down any high street and you can see that a highly racialized differentiation of labour continues. Seen it through the pandemic, who does care work, who does delivery work, who does driving work, who dies. All of that is it's still deeply embedded in the landscapes we live in, but maybe the patterns are getting a little less predictable, partly for horrible reasons, that people are being spat out of spaces that were slightly more racially privileged previously, maybe in a kind of battle with people who were drivers before. And all of those other differentiated spaces of everyday life are also kind of in flux, I think in particular around housing, because housing is in such crisis. So, well, people in the room might talk about housing more than me. It's very hard right now, I think, to see a mechanism that distributes people into a racialized hierarchy or pattern of wage, sometimes wage and unwaged work. There's still some people are hanging on to a more privileged waged category, but that's under attack all the time by these other kind of emergent processes. And I think in the process of this, tasks are becoming unanchored from particular locations, which has been so key to how we've seen the racialization of the economy. That this town, this space, this estate, this street, this bit of the nighttime economy, all of that seems much more fluid to me, but other people, again, undoubtedly know more about it than me. A couple of things that I think might be ways of thinking about what the continuing racialization of the economy is. The differentiated need to hustle. I like that phrase. So that everyone is precarious, but your need to hustle is differentiated. I might just leave that there and people might say more about it. But clearly there's some people, like if you have irregular immigration status or you've been displaced or where you live has just collapsed because of some other disaster, your need to hustle is at a different life or death level than the still with some small social safety net kind of hustling of the precarious worker in the global north, which might increasingly be all of us. And there might be gradations in between of how vulnerable you are to need to hustle or not. And alongside that, of course, debt is also on the surface undifferentiating, but people access debt through very different routes with very different possible outcomes. And again, I don't need to describe how dangerous indebtedness is for some groups in the community, especially those who are underprotected and over-policed. It means that indebtedness can be a situation of perpetual physical danger. And they're kind of different things. Right. So these are my last two bits. I do think that patterns of racialized differentiation continue but change as new modes of work and business arise. And I'm interested in what we can do to try and anticipate and spot and register those changes, because I think that must be part of the challenge. I don't want to spend my last years on going over a kind of debate about 1980s anti-racism and a state that no longer exists. Might as well have a lie down now. Let's not do that. In that process of shift in modes of work and business, some are incorporated into new forms of dangerous work and some are excluded, and both outcomes are bad, but with different impacts. My hunch is that with so many previous protections eroded, there's an uncertainty about what the wages of whiteness might be now. Because the wages of whiteness were always supposed to be a kind of combination of material advantage and kind of psychic affirmation. If you're left with only the psychic affirmation without any of the material infrastructure that in tiny ways lets you know all the time that whiteness counts, or what, it could be other kinds of racialized privilege of national belonging. I think there's something to be understood. And of course, previous sedimented histories of dispossession are in play, because none of us come naked to the new moment. But there are also new configurations. People can be dispossessed or demonized in new ways. People who were dispossessed for dodgy reasons can be the ones incorporated into new forms of dangerous work. That's kind of an insight from post-conflict analysis. And the emerging economic landscape may demand a revised approach to thinking about racialization through capitalism. Such a banal thing to say at the end, but it is my last thing to say. I think that we're living through a time that is disrupting the collective experiences of racialization. So that a demassification about where you live, where you work, where you're kind of associated with people like you, often mediated through relations to wagelessness. And I think that disruption of a previous massified experience of racialization is leading to this renewed sense that racialized subordination is just you alone. I know it's happening to others, but how I narrate it and experience it and encounter it is as an experience on me. Maybe not based in aversion. It might not be like people hate me. It might not be that old thing of like, it's just natural to hate people who don't look like you. But it's somehow constituted in the moment of interaction because of what's happened to our massified spaces. And there's something in that about state and unofficial forms of racist violence, I think, and other racist forms of dispossession. Because alongside this world remade by indebtedness and platformization, we're seeing a simultaneous expansion of prisons and bordering and the machineries of those two things often in coordination. This should be a whole other paper, which I think I think so much stuff, but this, I really do think this one, honestly, is that it's something like a new era of vagabondage. So as populations are uprooted, dispersed, made surplus, with an uncertainty about what our economic worth is like and where we could fit in, we're kind of in flux a bit. That's about all those young people trying to get bedsits in some part of the southeast because there's no work anywhere else. But globally, there's a version of that. And that means that those kind of instruments of violence come kind of forced onto populations as kind of a dispersal of official violence into everyday life. So this is the last bit. Sorry, I have over talked a bit, but I am on my last bit now. Although lots of people know me as someone who works on racial capitalism, I'm actually very uncertain about this framework. I like it because it helps me think about what works and doesn't work in the analytic and political languages available to me. It's not like a party I belong to. It's like kind of a better set of questions that helps me stretch myself. And I think that's the only point of thinking about racial capitalism. If it's not about innovating again ways of thinking that could make our lives better, survivable and more joyful, then I think it's not the right questions. Then let's ask something else. But to think of it as a framing of better and new and more kind of mobile questions means having to abandon the will to have the last word. That you said racial capitalism, I said racial heteropatriarchal capitalism. I won that battle. That's kind of, it's not that kind of story. Instead, I hope people have understood that what I'm interested in is how I might do work, and you and we together might do some work that is open to understanding how the enemy shifts. Because I really do want to impress on everyone I talk to these days that we have to build an anti-racism that's prepared for times when the powerful amend the terms of the racial and we are running along behind trying to catch up. I hope some of this made sense, especially via Zoom, which is always a challenge. Now, how do I stop sharing? Aha, here we go. And now we're in the room together. Lovely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gargi. That was a fascinating talk with loads in it. I feel I'm going to have to rewatch it, I think, to really take it all in. And obviously, loads in there with huge implications for our academic work and our academic thinking, but also our political organising as well. So I'd like to kind of, open it out now for questions, thoughts, discussion. If people want to either post things in the chat or even just let us know in the chat if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question. That seems to work quite well usually as well. I don't think we've got anything yet in the chat, but hopefully there are people wanting to ask questions. Yeah, Denise did ask, isn't the mechanism already there underlying everything? I think that was something that Gargi said during the presentation. Denise, I don't know if you want to come back to that and just clarify what the question was. No.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Basically, when you were saying, as you were talking, and I was thinking that, or what was coming to me is what's actually changed. The racialized exploitation and manipulation of the global population, it is long-standing. There's a mechanism in there for, I don't know whether it can be measured or identified properly, but it's already there. It's not something new. So I suppose that's why I was asking the question, isn't the mechanism, or it's almost like you're trying to reformulate something that keeps being shifted and talked about in different ways, and it's sort of like, it's almost like masking it, because I'm thinking here of like Charles Mills and the racial contract. He unpacked it quite well about what capitalism had done to the global population and how they'd gone off exploiting. So I suppose I'm not clear at what you're actually getting at in your argument.
Right. No, absolutely. That's really helpful. Thank you. And because I couldn't keep up with the chat, I missed what that was about. I really hear what you're saying, and precisely what you're saying about there being a long-standing established underlying mechanism, which means that capitalism just is racist, and racist to some groups of people, and has always been and will always be, is very established. And I'm not be a bit silly to kind of argue against that, but I also think that doesn't take us anywhere. It's like saying the devil is evil as a way of understanding how we are positioned and what happens. It's at two, yeah, I think capitalism is designed to kill some people, and it chooses to kill some people in a way that is linked to racialized description. I think there's some questions about who is seen as surplus in any moment, or what not seen. It's not like there's a capitalist subject out there saying, don't like the look of you today. There are different imperatives that make some populations surplus at some times. There are different interests in play that kind of battle around racialized description. Different things happen in what the remaking of capitalism in crisis is. So that's what I think is shifting. I think the key, one way, and I know people in Britain don't like to hear this, but I'll say it, keep saying it again, that although Britain has a very deeply established racial hierarchy, really, of like who counts and who doesn't, about how skin makes you a certain kind of not quite citizen, about how instruments of the state will come and be violent to you, that very established within the nation racial order has been seriously recontextualized by the violence of bordering. And there's an overlap. So some of the people who might be made into very vulnerable, even more underpoliced, almost non-people, might look like the people who are in the bottom of the within Britain racial order, and some don't. And it's not altogether predictable within the terms of what racial ordering within the nation means, of how that will play out when you do bordering and make migrant, foreigner, refugee, asylum seeker, or whatever we're going to say next, into a different racialized category. Now that a version of that, I think, is happening everywhere all of the time. It's not static. There's not some moment in the middle of the 17th century where Europe says, do you know what, all the rest of you, you're going to be losers for all eternity, and we play it out. There's some other set of battles about interest, reach, machinery of what capital is in different places, because it's not one thing. And I didn't even talk about climate crisis today. And that within that shifting machinery, different people win and lose. So I do think there's always racism, but I think who and how people get positioned, and whether that positioning is quite uncomfortable or deadly, that I think is always in flux. I don't expect most of the room to agree with that, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity to say it to you.
Thanks, Gargi. We had a hand up from Caroline Parker. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
great. So yeah, thanks for your talk. I am really interested in what you had to say about kind of this global variation of there not being one order, things looking different, this kind of notion of vagabondage. And I guess you didn't speak so much about which kind of sites you were thinking about, but I was very much inferring a UK context, and I work somewhere very different, which is in Puerto Rico, kind of US Caribbean colony. And one of the things that I also love the concept of racial capitalism, but I also find it really difficult, especially in settings where racialization has different kinds of recognition and invisibility, and in places, for example, where many people would think of themselves as racially mixed, and therefore it becomes more difficult to infer, you know, how racial hierarchy is ordered. And I wondered if from your own field site, which I'm thinking of a more UK context, whether you have any insights into for how we can think about racial capitalism beyond kind of black and white, and in places where racialization is more murky, and just from that experience. Thanks.
No, thank you. And I should say, you know, it's clear most of my work is in the UK, and my knowledge of labour markets is really European and North American, and maybe more European, really. But I think that question of places in which a very different language about internal racialized order, which is not at all the same as deracialized spaces, which I know is absolutely what you're saying, but just so I've said it as well. I think the question of racial capitalism is a good question there, because instead of saying, I can see the people and the people are raced, let me see where in the economy the people are, it says, if one of the central organizing processes that racializes populations is through the economic, as broad as the economic, which I've already said, I think spans social reproduction as well. How might thinking in that way help us to see what the processes of racialized subordination are through economic means or with economic readings? And that, I suspect, you know, I don't work on Puerto Rico, but when I've read about different parts of well, different societies in Central America where, as you say, there's a kind of such a strong assertion from the state itself about mixedness as a way of silencing what often state violences and certainly kind of extra state violences are. But there's something about those questions about saying, well, let's not look at political rights. Let's not look at all those terrible indices the UN does. And I know the UN does it for good reason. How many people from this community got elected, who's in the papers. That tells you some things. Let's think of the distribution of the resources of life in a space and how different groups of people can and cannot access them, what economic opportunities and non-opportunities and active violences to prevent the remaking of life happen, and think of all of that as what racialization is. And that seems to me, again, I don't work on Puerto Rico, but even if you read the news about Puerto Rico, that sounds pretty much like Puerto Rico right now.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, just thank you. And yeah, I think that the levels of obfuscation get really, really complicated and even go kind of beyond state practices we see now to like very deeply held cultural senses of, we're all one. And, that means that like the reports about police brutality and violence in Puerto Rico come out a lot, but they don't really go anywhere near talking about race because nobody knows how to talk about it because it just seems so fuzzy. So yeah, it's a whole thing, but thanks.
Does the person who said something about whiteness want to speak? Sorry, Scarlett is chairing.
Okay, no, I think we just had a hand up. We've had another hand up for a while, so I'll go to
sorry.
Miles first, and then we'll take Mustafa's question in the chat. Miles, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, if Mustafa's question was more relevant to that answer, I don't mind waiting. Or I can go now. Sure. Yeah, sorry. So a bit of a scrambled question. Yeah, I just
Sounds not great. I'm going to switch off my mic in case that helps.
Okay. Yeah, can you hear me okay? Cool. I'm really kind of intrigued by, I really appreciate your use of the kind of word survival and, even that quote earlier, the differentiate need to hustle as kind of like describing those conditions and the kind of the result of that demassification, putting that as a kind of individual need of survival. in your book on rethinking racial capitalism, I really enjoyed the kind of, well, appreciated. You're talking about the kind of like stigmatization of, groups that kind of have methods of social reproduction or reproduction more generally that don't serve the market, right? And so I was just kind of wondering, what are the kind of spaces that you see as that? I have this complicated in my head. What are the kind of spaces that you see as a kind of possibility of a kind of anti-racial capitalist life, and how does that kind of have an appeal? Because I suppose where I've seen that kind of an example, and particularly within the UK or in Spain, where I've lived, or even in Mexico, I guess, like this, when this does happen, like you say, it is very stigmatized, and it's pretty kind of alien to a lot of people, and it doesn't have the kind of, I suppose, I wonder what are the kind of possibilities you see of a kind of broader way of that, and how that happens, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. That's kind of, well, this is a discussion for all of us together, isn't it? It's also a question about practice. So I've tried to suggest previously, or I'm still thinking this, that the misuse of differently collaborative social reproduction practices has been used as another tool of racial subordination. So that's what we're describing. So if you live in a community who doesn't get to have loads of wage workers, but your extended family will feed you, or you live in apartheid South Africa and the wages of Black workers are artificially depressed in order to fit a white supremacist vision, but half of your economic activity is linked around a different kind of model of mutual survival within your own, within your own ancestral homeland. Or if you're just remaking what effective relations are, and the remaking of life is outside of a norm which is increasingly not even the norm here. People should remember, people are not really even living like this here, because the infrastructure of life doesn't fit the idea of that ideal. So it's kind of, we say that normal people over there do this, normal white people, they don't even do it either. All of that has been stigmatized. Stigmatized, I think, is like, it's not too strong a word. It's not, some of it has been stigmatized, sometimes for particular policy processes, like some kinds of mothering, but more, I think, has been, I've forgotten the word, scraped, kind of misused to sustain some other monster. I think that's all a bit up in the air now, because I think those ideas of, which were never absolute, but kind of functioned well enough as a fantasy of white heteronormative social reproduction, other kinds of racialized social reproduction that might mess with gender and sexuality and ethnicity and class in lots of ways, but where households are a bit kind of not so tidily nuclear. Because we live in a world where the world of work no longer enables that, and the infrastructure of everyday life, which seems to still flow from capital, really, including like where you can live and where you can eat and how far you have to travel and that kind of stuff, just doesn't seem in play, then it seems to me that our collective challenge is both to, well, I don't know if it's still to seize the means of production. That's a whole other paper, isn't it? What does it mean to seize the means of production in the moment of the indebtedness and the platform economy? Search me. Let's come back another day for that one. But it must be to remake the terms of social reproduction collectively together in a time when we are split from each other, which is, I guess, is really your question. And that what we're seeing is a different experiments in people trying to learn to say that to each other as both a survival project and a political project. And I think that's historically significant, that we see such a range of those experiments in very different locations in our moment, because that's also like a signal of what is in crisis and what people need. So I don't have an answer. I just think, again, that must be part of the game for us, mustn't it? I don't want to be on my deathbed and say, oh no, collective social reproduction, didn't think of that. At least let us also think of that. So people are writing lots of stuff, which I'm not reading. Maybe I don't need to read it. I'll go back and read it now.
Don't worry, I'm keeping track of different bits.
Okay, right, okay.
Can we go back to Mustafa's question, which, sorry, is a bit going maybe.
Yeah, no, and I can see some of the other stuff is a comment as well.
Yeah. So I think Mustafa, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, if it makes sense, just written in the chat. I know it was in relation to something you said slightly earlier, Gargi.
Yeah. Absolutely, thank you, Scarlett. And really, the question that I want to ask is against the background of what Gargi said early on, this notion of the malleability and the changing feature of the enemy, so to speak. But I'm just really, what strikes me is this sort of like notion of whiteness itself. Can we just sort of detach it from this sort of like notion of boundary sitting, this notion of establishing hierarchy through that sort of like historical sort of junctures, and see it just as another sort of, another ethnic composition? Or is this something constant about it for its capacity to establish its boundaries? And that's really the sort of, what I'm trying to grapple with, is can we read whiteness as inherently and essentially divisive, hierarchizing as such, or does it shift, does it changes? And that's what I want to sort of just wonder if
I'll say my cop-out answer first, and I'll try and be more serious. So I think the cop-out answer, which I do still believe, is that as long as we believe it's whiteness, it is only an instrument of violence. So I do think whiteness, as the category whiteness, cannot be reclaimed or made just another ethnicity. Whiteness is not even an ethnicity, is it? So, like, let's not.
No.
Not like what's the language of whiteness? What do white people eat? It's not an ethnicity. But neither do I think those temporarily categorized as white are somehow inevitably linked to this fictional category. I also think other categories can have that, can take that space of violence. I'm thinking Hinduness. Someone from the Indian diaspora, my family haven't been there for a long time, but look, Hinduness looks pretty much like the violence of whiteness if you look at the things happening. So I don't think there's anything intrinsic. I know whiteness has had a different purchase because it is the only arbitrary racialized categorization that has had a global reach and a global ordering. That's about a particular history of capitalism, isn't it? That's about the rise of Europe, the expansion of Europe. That could have been something else. But I do think that there's nothing stable even about the supremacist categories. And the supremacist categories have to do much more work than we often say to each other to keep remaking and reestablishing their position. And that these other material changes around the edges are always kind of chivying them around a bit. Someone's written a really great comment about histories of whiteness. And I can, sorry, the thing about saying that in the US, the idea you might just amend whiteness to be a little bit more inclusive or put the boundaries somewhere else. I'm not saying we should underestimate that. That's also what I mean about amending the racial landscape. That one approach to a crisis is to just slightly shift the terms of membership. If I can't give this bit of the previous labor aristocracy even clean water, look at different parts of the states, but maybe I can still remake something that's very close to the racial contract just by slightly changing here. A few Southeast Asian tech workers here, and I'm not saying that can't happen, but I think it is something for us to clock, I mean just better see, just encounter and have in our mix of how we think about what is happening. I don't know, is that an answer? Might be,
Absolutely.
I have to
Great.
put up
Thank
with
you.
it, I'm afraid, even if it's not.
Sure. Thank you.
Brilliant. I think we've got about 10 minutes left before we really have to wrap things up. Siobhan has had a hand up for a while. Siobhan, I don't know if you want to come in.
Yeah, I was just, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. There was just like a couple times when you said, I don't think everyone in the room will agree with me, or like just, I think 1 or 2 times you said that. And I was just curious, like why that is, or what you think people who also work on like racial capitalism or race stuff, what do they find so challenging or like disagreeable about your arguments?
Yes. And I shouldn't big myself up, because that's some kind of humble bragging, isn't it? That I'm so controversial, and when I come in the room, you all can't think anymore. I don't mean that either. I just think, I was thinking this morning, and there was a bit of an exchange on Twitter as well, that I think even people I'm very politically close to, people of goodwill, people, you know, all of us in the battle to try and make the world more livable, to really say to each other that race is completely malleable. It's quite a big ask, I think. I don't think we've kind of settled that amongst ourselves. So it's mainly that one, I think. And because of this urgent need to think reparatively about what the ongoing legacies of histories of racialized violence have been, it feels that if you say that race is malleable, that you're disallowing that, which I think is the other urgent bit. That, you know, we cannot go forward together without some way of encountering what that history of racialized violence and thinking about what repair means. But at the same time, I think in our urgent need for collective approaches to repair, we can't take our eye off the ball in terms of how new violences are coming down the road. So miserable on both sides. It's kind of my answer.
Thank you.
Great. Kerry, did you want to? I just wondered if you wanted to come back on the conversation on whiteness. I know you put a little comment in the chat that Gargi referred to. I didn't know if you.
I guess my question, the part that might be controversial, is that the end question, you know, of to what extent whiteness will just reformulate itself and remains highly relevant as a structuring force, you know. So I use the US examples because that's what I work on, and there it obviously seems very resilient when you think about you know, contemporary flows of migrant labor and the ways in which some people have been kind of moved into the white category and others have not, and it's continued to structure how capitalism operates and the labor force. But I don't know much about the UK context in that kind of language, so I wonder what the case is to be made around that, because that sounds like a provocative argument to me.
And I think that's partly what you're describing. You know, again, I've already said it, but I'll say it again, that it is that need that even to maintain the fiction of whiteness requires this constant adaptation. So that's just kind of a lesson for all of us, isn't it? Because that shifts how we think about what our political positioning is. If we think, oh, actually, this thing which is meant to be the monolithic edifice is this constantly remaking, oh, do you want to join us? Oh, you're no good anymore, kind of alliance building. That's quite an important political and analytic lesson for all of us. And I think you're right that literature is almost non-existent outside of North America. So there's and even the language of whiteness is quite muted outside of North America. So then I don't often talk about whiteness, because I think, you know, it could, yeah, we all know right here it's whiteness, but it need not be. There's other kinds of things that can be in other places. What matters is the mechanism and how we understand that.
And I think Denise is going to jump in, but I think there's something to be said about Blackness in this context too, and about the fixicity. I can see Denise is laughing because I think she's probably going to make a comment around this, but the fixicity of Blackness and its function within this kind of structure too. So Denise, anyway, I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I'm really struggling with this sort of like the fiction of whiteness as a Black person, because you've got like the white and Black sort of dichotomy, and if you put whiteness as a fiction, it's almost like you're eradicating the Blackness and the sort of like the crimes against humanity and so on, and the ongoing struggles of Black. So I'm just struggling with sort of like And I don't know whether this issue is around the fact that there is a definitely clear set defined whiteness. Well, obviously it can be a little bit fluid, but it's pretty well defined in some ways. And then you've got all the groups along the middle strata that are not necessarily, like in the UK, sort of like embroiled in that battle. And it's like blackness is evil and whiteness is good. So I am really struggling. Well, I wouldn't accept this thing about whiteness being a fiction, because it clearly is not a fiction and it's been used to terrorize. So I suppose that's just what I wanted to raise.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you've said it, because that's exactly what I mean about people finding it hard to hear the point I'm making. So, of course, I don't mean whiteness has not been one of the most murderous forces in human history, but that doesn't mean that there's some real essence of whiteness that enacted that. So if we unless we think that race is a real thing, we have, so fiction, I mean, you know, a historical construct, a temporary alliance, a power grouping, a gang through history, all of those things I'd accept. But the whiteness of it, that's the language of alliance. And powerful people didn't always call themselves white. And you know, and I'll say it again, that partly I'm interested because there are places in the world where extreme genocidal racist violence is being enacted right now, and it doesn't need to touch the language of whiteness or blackness at all. And and I think at least even if we end up saying, look, these are different things, I think part of our job is to at least kind of try, why is all this stuff happening at the same time in this moment with these kind of parallel kinds of economic restructurings? So yes, I don't mean whiteness didn't exist and doesn't still exist and doesn't still kill people, but there's a kind of arbitrariness about who gets to be white, who aligns as white together. It's not always fixed around the edges, and it's not always whiteness that does it. It's not whiteness that's killing Chinese Muslims, I don't think. It's not whiteness that's shutting down Kashmir and shooting all the young people in the eye. I'm not sure it's, well, it's more questionable, but I'm not sure it's whiteness that's bombing Gaza secretly every 3 months. And I do think those are racialized genocidal violences of our moment of racial capitalism in crisis. So because I'm interested in, yeah, there's a white world that orders the world and says blackness is the thing to be most dehumanized. And then there's also across the world these people being killed on racial grounds who don't easily fit into that model.
Could I just add that when you're saying that there are other things going on in the world that are have nothing to do with whiteness, and I'm just thinking in terms of the global context, quite often when you unpack a conflict going on in the world, you will find whiteness somewhere there. That is agitated, and then they step back and then say, we weren't involved, look at these naughty brown black people and whatever, look how uncivilized they are. So I don't think it's as simplistic as sort of like we need to see a white person or whiteness there in order for them to have some sort of like serious involvement. And there have been plenty, I think there have been plenty of crimes against humanity where when you unpack it, it's been stirred up by white. So I suppose for me, I just think it's the way that whiteness, it puts itself into lots of different things and changes its manifestations. That has to be unpacked.
I'm just checking the site. I mean, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, of course, there's also the endless shadow of neocolonialism. But I still think that's not enough. As long as we believe there are real people called white folk somewhere who did it, I don't think we're going to build a better world together. That's my bottom line. I don't think we're going to agree, but I really want people to hear that's what my belief is.